not so long ago. We work with companies that have plants spread out, well, across the world. A company that has 18 plants, another one that has 7 plants around the world. One in Brazil, one in New Zealand, one in wherever. Eastern Europe, they have 2. Europe, Western Europe, they have another 2. And in Africa, they have something like 2. So these companies that have several plants spread out worldwide, when they are searching for a software, they very, very often just neglect important stuff related to the implementation. And it's not just, the coding systems, having uniformization around each plant. Cultures are different, people are different, people have different engagement with companies in different parts of the world. It boils down to that. It's that simple to understand. And in those cases, in bigger projects, let's say in more complex digitalization projects, in cases, for example, when companies have several plants spread out around the world, there are an immense amount of things that need to be considered. And one of those things is people using the system and implementing the system in Portugal is going to be very, very different. That implementation project is going to be very, very different than the implementation project in Romania, say, or even very, very different from an implementation in Vietnam. Same company, okay, but very different scenarios here. And not just the cultural gap I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a bunch of things that need to be considered when you're working in multinational business in digitalization projects, because that is where our knowledge is more valuable. This is what we know to be true. So you have very, very different scenarios, and yet you have a centralized company over here that needs to make sure that everyone is, so to speak, working the right way. I mean, the bottom line of implementing a software for a company with 16, 17 or 20 plants worldwide is to get them to, of course, use the system. That's number one. And ideally, to get them to use the system in a relatively standard way that will enable that same company, to benefit from things that are working in that plant that should be working elsewhere, and things that are working really well in that plant that eventually should spread out throughout the other plants. The benchmark opportunity is immense. And the bottom line is, if you don't get people to work with the system, then nothing else is possible. But let's assume that you do get people to use the system on a daily basis. Well, that's great. That's an excellent way to start. But then, one plant works in one way and the other plant might work in another way. Okay, getting them to work with the system is the first rule. The second one would be to getting them to use the system in a relatively standard way. The same activities, the same types, the same procedures in place, and the same indicators, the same KPIs. All this needs to be kind of standardized so as to, you need to be looking at the same thing. When you are managing 17 or 20 plants, you can't, mix oranges with apples. You need to look at apples all the time. So you need to make sure, number one, that they are using the system, and number two, that they are using it in a relatively standardized way. And that leads me to the third important critical part of any international digitalization process. You need people managing this project. People from corporate, that is, or even people that they don't need to be from corporate, but you need to have 1, 2, 3 people that centralize everything about the implementation of a CMMS in those 20 plants. Those 3 people are the 3 people that are going to make sure that, number one, everyone is working, number two, everyone is working in a relatively standardized way, and number 3, they are producing the same type of quality data. And this is the only way that you will be able to share information amongst each plant. Otherwise, and once again, when a client comes up to us and says, I want all plants working the same way so we can have benchmark and synergies as much as possible. Well, that's great. That really is a phenomenal scenario to think about in the future. But dudes, you need to start thinking about the first steps here. It's great that you have that horizon, that scenario in mind. That's perfect. But there are so many steps. It's going to be a long journey. And as a salesperson, we need to tell this to the client. There are 12 steps that you need to go through before you reach even, the necessary conditions to be there where you want to be. 12 steps, let's say. And the first step is to implement the system in each plant. That alone will take you some time. And we'll get, because it means having 20 plants. Let's say an average team of 8 people in a maintenance department. Let's say 10 people just to be be simpler. You have 10 people in each plant that will use the system. It's going to be more, but let's just put 10 for now. You have 10 people in each plant. 20 plants, that's 200 people that need to be properly trained and need to just be properly trained, need to understand the system, of course, and they need to motivated, engaged with the system in a way that gets them to consistently report stuff in the system, and motivated in a way that disciplines them in feeding the system daily. So that's a tremendous endeavor you have here. And once again, not impossible. We've seen this happen before, but we've seen it fail also, because you need to go through these steps. So if you skip these steps, it's going to bite you in the ass later. And this is our role as salespeople, to get the clients to think about this, to challenge them, to say, yes, this is possible, but dude, you need to think about this first. Okay, have you thought about this? Oh, we thought that, yeah, well, okay, that's not correct. And you need to be able to say, possible client, you need to be able to tell them, you are not thinking about the whole thing. You're missing a lot of parts of the big picture. You're looking there, but you're missing a lot of parts that you should consider. And it's our role to actually tell them this.